Alicia Henderson sat nervously in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She was a single mother of two, a hard-working woman who had done everything to provide a better future for her children. But today, none of that seemed to matter. She was facing charges for a nonviolent offense, one she had been drawn into under difficult circumstances. Alicia believed justice would prevail. After all, she had faith in the system, even if it didn't always feel fair. The judge presiding over the case was Harold Whitmore, a stern man known for his harsh rulings, especially against people of color. His face was cold and unreadable as he flipped through the papers in front of him. The prosecutor painted Alicia as a threat to society, twisting facts to fit their narrative. Her defense lawyer tried to argue her case, highlighting her struggles and the lack of evidence proving her intent to commit a crime. But Alicia could sense the room was against her. She felt invisible, as if her words carried no weight. When the moment came for sentencing, the tension in the room was unbearable. Alicia held her breath, hoping for mercy. Judge Whitmore's voice was steady and emotionless as he delivered the verdict. "Alicia Henderson, I sentence you to 105 years in prison." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Alicia's knees nearly buckled, and her lawyer looked stunned. The sentence was outrageously harsh for the charges. It felt like a punishment for her existence, not her alleged crime. Tears welled up in Alicia's eyes as she turned to see her children in the back of the courtroom. They were too young to fully understand, but their frightened faces broke her heart. Community members in attendance shook their heads in disbelief. The whispered accusations of racism grew louder. People knew this wasn't about justice. It was about bias, about a system that had failed countless others like Alicia. Judge Whitmore stood and left the courtroom without so much as a glance in Alicia's direction. For him, it was just another case. But for Alicia, it was the end of the life she had worked so hard to build. As she was led away in handcuffs, one thought burned in her mind. This wasn't over. Judge Harold Whitmore sat alone in his chambers, the verdict still fresh in his mind. To him, it was just another case, another ruling. He had delivered hundreds like it before. Yet, somewhere deep down, a faint unease stirred, a feeling he couldn't quite place. But Whitmore brushed it off. He had built his career on being firm and unyielding, and this was no different. His reputation as a no-nonsense judge was what kept him in power, even as whispers of bias trailed behind him. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with outrage. Alicia's community gathered in small groups, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. Many knew her personally, knew she wasn't a criminal. She was a mother who worked long shifts at the diner, a neighbor who always lent a hand. To them, her sentencing wasn't just about Alicia. It was about years of unfair treatment, about a system designed to crush people who looked like her. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras capturing the heated emotions. Activists, already familiar with Judge Whitmore's history, began to speak out. They listed cases where his rulings had disproportionately affected minorities, where he had handed down excessively harsh sentences without blinking an eye. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law. It had become a battlefield of racial injustice. Meanwhile, Alicia's family was reeling. Her sister, Naomi, clutched her phone, scrolling through endless news articles about the trial. Her face burned with frustration as she read the judge's history. "How can they let him keep doing this?" she muttered. Naomi wasn't one to sit quietly. She knew she had to fight for her sister, even if the odds were stacked against them. That night, Naomi called their father, James Henderson. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since a bitter falling out had split their family. But this was different. "Dad, we need your help," she said, her voice trembling. There was silence on the line before James finally spoke. "I'll be there," he said firmly. Unbeknownst to the world, James had a past with Judge Whitmore, a connection that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. As the protests grew louder and the community demanded justice, secrets from the judge's own life were about to surface, threatening to unravel everything he thought he knew. James Henderson arrived in the city the next morning, his face set with determination. He had left years ago, believing it was best for everyone. Now, seeing the injustice his daughter faced, he knew he couldn't stay away. Alicia's plight reminded him of the battles he had fought in the past, both in the courtroom and in his personal life. As a retired lawyer, James had once been known for taking on tough cases and exposing corruption. This time, the fight felt even more personal. Naomi greeted him at the door, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "She doesn't even know you're here," Naomi said, crossing her arms. "You're a little late for a father figure." James didn't flinch at her words. He understood her anger. "I'm not here to make up for the past," he said quietly. "I'm here to help." Together, they pored over the court transcripts, witness statements, and evidence presented at Alicia's trial. James's sharp legal mind immediately picked up on inconsistencies. The evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. It didn't warrant such a harsh sentence. "This wasn't justice," James muttered, his voice low and steady. This was personal. As James dug deeper, he began to uncover something strange. Old photographs and legal documents led him to a startling realization. He and Judge Harold Whitmore shared a connection he hadn't seen coming. Decades ago, when James was just a young man, his mother had revealed a family secret. His father, a man he had never met, was white and came from a powerful, well-connected family. James hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the pieces were falling into place. Late one night, James stared at a faded photograph of his mother, young and smiling, standing next to a man in a tailored suit. The man's features were unmistakable. They looked eerily similar to Judge Whitmore. The truth hit James like a thunderbolt. If he was right, then Harold Whitmore wasn't just a man abusing his power. He was family. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If this connection was real, it could change everything. But how would he prove it? And even if he did, would it be enough to save Alicia? The stakes had never been higher, and James knew he was about to confront a man who had every reason to bury the truth. James decided he couldn't wait any longer. If his suspicion about Judge Whitmore was correct, the judge needed to know the truth. It wasn't just about Alicia anymore. It was about exposing a past that had been buried for decades. Armed with the photograph and documents he had uncovered, James made his way to the courthouse. He didn't request a meeting through formal channels. He knew Harold would refuse. Instead, he waited in the hallway outside the judge's chambers, his heart pounding with anticipation. When Judge Whitmore stepped out, James stood in his path. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and Harold's expression hardened. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Harold asked, his voice cold. James held out the photograph. "We need to talk. This isn't about Alicia's case. It's about us." Harold hesitated, but curiosity, or perhaps the faintest flicker of recognition, drew him into his office. Once inside, James laid out everything he had discovered. He spoke calmly but firmly, recounting his mother's story, the secret she had shared, and the undeniable resemblance between Harold's father and James himself. "Whether you admit it or not, we're connected," James said. "We share blood." The judge's face turned pale, his usual confidence faltering. "This is absurd," Harold snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. He stared at the photograph, his hand trembling slightly as he picked it up. Memories he had long suppressed began to resurface. Whispers in his family about a scandal, a child born out of wedlock. Harold had ignored them for years, determined to distance himself from anything that could tarnish his image. But now, confronted by James, the truth was impossible to ignore. James didn't let up. "You've spent your life judging people like me, people like Alicia, without ever understanding their struggles. And all this time, you've been turning your back on your own family." Harold sat down heavily, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He tried to dismiss it, to convince himself it didn't matter. But deep down, he knew it did. If James was telling the truth, everything Harold thought he knew about himself, and the choices he had made, would come into question. For the first time in years, Judge Whitmore felt vulnerable, and James could see it. Harold Whitmore sat in his office long after James had left, staring at the photograph on his desk. The resemblance was undeniable, and the story James had told him was too detailed to dismiss as a fabrication. For the first time, Harold felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in. He had built his career on a foundation of power, control, and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. Now that foundation was crumbling under the weight of an inconvenient truth. The protests outside the courthouse grew louder with each passing day. Activists demanded justice for Alicia and called for Harold's removal from the bench. The media had latched onto the case, with headlines branding him as a symbol of systemic racism. Harold prided himself on ignoring public opinion, but this time, the pressure was impossible to escape. Everywhere he turned, he was reminded of Alicia's case and his own complicity in a broken system. Meanwhile, James wasn't done. He reached out to Alicia's lawyer, sharing the new evidence he had uncovered about the case. Together, they pieced together a clear picture of the flaws in the trial. Witnesses had been pressured, evidence had been mishandled, and Harold's bias had influenced every decision. "This isn't just about exposing the truth," James told the lawyer. "It's about forcing Harold to confront what he's done, not just to Alicia but to countless others." Harold began to feel the weight of his past decisions. James's words haunted him, and he started to revisit the cases he had presided over. Each file told a story of lives he had ruined with his harsh sentences, many of them disproportionately targeting minorities. For years, Harold had justified his actions as simply enforcing the law. Now he saw them for what they were, acts of prejudice disguised as justice. One night, unable to sleep, Harold pulled out a letter his father had written to him decades ago. In it, his father had admitted to his mistakes, including the affair that had resulted in James's birth. "We all carry our sins, Harold," the letter read. "But it's how we choose to face them that defines who we are." Harold knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. If he wanted to salvage any part of his integrity, he had to make things right. But the question remained, was he willing to risk his career and reputation to do so? The next morning, Harold arrived at the courthouse with a heavy heart. His mind was racing, and the weight of the decisions he had to make pressed down on him. The media outside was relentless, the protests only growing stronger. Alicia's case had become a symbol for everything wrong with the justice system. For the first time, Harold wasn't sure where he stood in all of it. His life, his career, everything he had worked for, was unraveling before his eyes. He walked into his chambers, feeling the familiar coldness of the room, but today it felt different. Today it was no longer just a place where he handed down judgments. Today it was where he would face his own reckoning. The photograph James had shown him sat on his desk, a constant reminder of the past he had tried to forget. Harold knew he had to make a decision, one that would change everything. Before he could even sit down, his secretary knocked on the door and entered. "Judge Whitmore, there's a call for you," she said, handing him the receiver. It was his father's lawyer. The voice on the other end was somber. "Judge Whitmore," the lawyer began, "your father has passed away. I'm sorry to inform you. He left some documents for you to review. It's important." The words hit Harold like a punch to the gut. His father, the man who had shaped his sense of right and wrong, was gone. But the real shock came when the lawyer continued. "Your father requested that you look at these documents immediately. They are about your family, and about James Henderson." Harold's mind spun as the lawyer gave him the details. The documents were sealed, but they contained evidence of the affair and its aftermath, along with a secret that Harold's father had kept hidden all these years, Harold's role in helping cover up the truth. The weight of this new revelation nearly knocked Harold off balance. His father had used his power to protect the family name, hiding the truth from the public and from Harold himself. With trembling hands, Harold hung up the phone. He felt trapped in a web of lies, lies that stretched far beyond his own life and into the very heart of the justice system he had sworn to uphold. For the first time, he understood the depth of his father's actions and how they had shaped his own path. But now, Harold had a choice: continue to protect the legacy of lies, or confront the truth, no matter the cost. Harold couldn't shake the weight of the decision that lay ahead. His father's death, the family secrets, and the truth about Alicia's case had all collided into a single, undeniable moment. As he sat at his desk, staring at the sealed documents in front of him, he knew there was no turning back. If he opened them, his entire life would change. The career he had built, the reputation he had worked so hard to protect, it all hung in the balance. The courthouse was eerily quiet that afternoon. The usual hustle and bustle seemed distant, like the world outside had forgotten him. Harold's mind replayed everything that had led him here: his father's hidden past, the revelations about his own role in perpetuating the system of injustice, and most painfully, Alicia's case. He had sentenced her, knowing in his gut it wasn't right, but justifying it in the name of order and the law. Now, the law he had once trusted felt like an empty shell. As he reached for the documents, his phone buzzed. It was Naomi, Alicia's sister. She was demanding to speak with him, and Harold knew this conversation was long overdue. With a deep breath, he answered. "Naomi," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I know what you want. I know what you're going to ask me." Naomi didn't hesitate. "You have to fix this. You have to fix what you've done to my sister. She didn't deserve this. None of us did. But we know you can make it right. You know the truth." Harold sat back in his chair, her words piercing through the walls he had spent so long building around himself. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "There's so much more to this than you realize. I've been living a lie. But I have to do something. I have to face this." Naomi's voice softened. "Then do it. Do what you know is right." With those words ringing in his ears, Harold felt the final barrier crumble. He opened the documents. The truth laid out in front of him was undeniable. His father's manipulation, his own role in upholding a corrupt system, it was all there. But so was the solution: a way to expose the truth, a path to clear Alicia's name, and perhaps his own redemption. It wasn't going to be easy, and the consequences would be far-reaching, but for the first time in years, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He had a chance to make amends, to stand for something greater than himself, and he knew, no matter what it cost him, he had to take that chance.